It's a open panel, so feel free to stick your hand up and ask questions, and Claire will come and give you a microphone, and I'll give you a minute when it's appropriate. Let's start at the far end with Scott with his first minute opening remarks.
Hello, is that on later? So my name is Damian Smith, still a UKIP member but not a participating UKIP member, and naturally voted to leave in the referendum. I'll read out my opening statement. I was sat in a pub a few months ago and I was talking about the Nigel Farage's book they released, which I have here, The Purple Revolution, and I thought this is a man that was made in the 1980s, and I thought, well, he can't have named his book that without reference to the Prince album from 1984. Even the E-V-O-L is switched backwards, so all the Prince identity is there. And in this song, Purple Rain, which I hope a lot of you like, there's the lyrics, honey, I have no time to change it. It's time we all reach out for something new. That means you too. You say you want a leader, but you can't seem to make up your mind. I think you better close it and let me guide you to the Purple Rain land. Now, the reason I mention this is because it is, I think, quite funny that we're in a crisis in the West where leadership, there's a big question mark over leadership. Is there any leadership that we can believe in? Are people still on board with what we like to call the elites and what they tell us? And this brings us to the British Conservative Party, because I think a lot of the debate now we're leaving, is going to centre around the British Conservative Party, whether it has the means or the will to leave the European Union. And because the British Conservative Party, I think, was an integral part to our history with Europe since the end of the Second World War. And it's always been through the British Conservative Party has always been the agent that has conducted our relationship with the European Union. And we need to look at the history of the British Conservative Party throughout time to see whether or not they truly are Eurosceptic, as some people like to say, or whether they're actually closet Europhiles, and whether they actually believe in the European project. That's all I want to say.
Let's move on now to Scott.
Hello, I'm Scott Davidson. I'm the Vice President of Nottingham Trent Conservative Society and a member of the Conservative Party. I voted to leave the European Union in the referendum, and I'm very pleased that I did. And the Conservative Party is definitely going to ensure Britain leaves the European Union. We've set the date, although there is a bit of funny business with the bills going through Parliament at the moment. We will be leaving on that date, whether it's on the front of the bill or not. In terms of the Europhiles in the Conservative Party, yes, there are members of the Conservative Party who are supportive of the European Union, and yes, there are some that voted to remain, and some that, well, Ken Clarke ignored the will of the people and still voted to remain even after the referendum. But that is not the majority view of the Conservative Party, it is not the majority view of Parliament, and we will be leaving the European Union.
And now to Chris.
Hello there, I'm Chris. I'm the President of the Debating Society, libertarian and passionate Leave supporter. And I suppose, for opening remarks, Brexit represents the best thing that could ever happen to the working class. The true benefits of it will make themselves known in due course. I think that's really it. I want to keep it short and then get into the proper stuff later.
Hi, my name is Saunders. I'm part of the Debating Society. I have no political affiliation, but I am very much a pro-Remain of the EU. I promise I will not mention turkeys and Christmas tonight. That is my key promise. Basically, I am a passionate European, a great believer in the European project, and I feel that Brexit is a failure of both imagination on the part of the EU and a cynical attempt by the British Conservative Party to shore up internal control by pandering to the right-wing ideology within their own party, and also pandering to the Brexit panic that was being swept up by UKIP prior to the last one election. In 1972, when Britain joined the EU, the Conservative Prime Minister Edward stated that this is uniting a friendly state within a framework of a single community, which has been brought about by sustained and dedicated work of many people. He was not thinking today at that point of the age of imperialism, which was then in the past and still in the past, but of the lasting creative effects of the spread of language and culture, of commerce, of administration by people from across Europe, across land and sea, to the other continents of the world. These were the essential ties that the European Union wanted to create, and they would bind Europe as a whole in friendship with the rest of mankind. Following on from that, we also had Enoch Powell quoted in his infamous River of the Blood speech. He stated that here was a decent, ordinary fellow Englishman who in broad daylight to his own MP stated that the country would not be worth living for his children if members of the Commonwealth were kept in the country. Unfortunately, in this post-Brexit world, I feel that that is the ultimate endorsement of Enoch Powell's ideology, that we are facing massive issues of immigration that are not being addressed, and that Brexit will not address because of the erosion of civil rights that are being created due to the implementation of legislation. This is the world we've come to.
We'll move on then again. Now to Ben.
Thank you. Hello, my name's Ben. I'm President of Young Liberals. I voted to remain, but I put a bet on leaving and I actually won it. So I'm probably the only person who actually made money from us leaving the European Union. I feel that for what it's worth, for keeping peace and security-ish, the European Union has done a good job. Obviously it's flawed, like many other cases. But overall, I think it's a good thing, and that obviously to keep the status quo, to stay culturally, economically, is debatable. But I'm a pro-European. I live part-time in France, so I feel that it's not just English, Britain, United Kingdom, but we are a member of a larger society, a larger group of collective people. Thank you.
And last but not least, Neil.
Hi, my name is Neil. I am the Equalities Officer of the Labour Society. So ideologically, I'd say I was a socialist, and during the referendum, I was quite conflicted at first. So on one hand, I felt like it would be economically very dangerous for us to leave the EU. On the other hand, I felt like there's a lot of social, left-leaning reasons that you want to do that. In the end, I did vote to remain, and I generally supported the Another Europe is Possible campaign, which the general idea was that we can still reform the EU, that is still possible. Unfortunately, that doesn't really matter as much now, we are voted to leave, so my general views are, it's quite simple. I want us to try as hard as we can to get as good a deal as possible for leaving the EU, but if we go through this, we go through the negotiation deals and it looks very bleak and grim, I don't think this country should do something that should harm us. The government in our country is here to protect us, and at the end of the day we should try and make sure that happens. Thank you.
Alright, thank you for your opening remarks, everyone. So first I'd like to pose the question about aims and priorities and what should they be going through the process. Let's start in the middle of this time with Rachel.
Okay, as a Remainer, I think the key goal should be to secure freedom of movement for British EU citizens to ensure that skills, jobs and trade can continue unfettered. The problem is that there's an awful lot of issues surrounding Northern Ireland that, unless they're resolved, could become a major sticking point within any deal that's secured. So, as such, I believe that there should be a free trade zone opened in Northern Ireland to ensure that both the Good Friday Agreement can remain intact and also ensure that the Northern Irish economy does not spot at all ports, which will also serve as a gateway from the EU back into mainland Britain.
Excellent. Let's go now to Scott to answer the same question. What should our aims and priorities be?
Britain's aims and priorities when we leave the European Union should be to allow the UK to trade with other countries outside of the European Union. That was one of the main reasons that I voted to leave, because currently there are hundreds of countries that we do not have free trade agreements with, and that's a terrible pity really, because if you look at countries like South Korea, they have free trade agreements with 150 countries, several countries have 100 or more free trade agreements, and we're not one of them sadly, because we are locked inside the European Union, and we cannot make free trade agreements with the rest of the world as members of the European Union. They block us with the customs union. And I think it's brilliant to allow free trade between countries like Algeria in Africa and the United Kingdom, because then we can get food much cheaper. Food in Algeria is a third of the price of food in the United Kingdom, and it would also help the economies of places like Africa and Asia, because obviously they would be able to trade with us on much better terms. The second priority when we leave is to ensure that Parliament has its sovereignty restored, and that means leaving the European Court of Justice and not letting them have any influence over any decisions relating to any trials that happen affecting British citizens or European citizens in Britain. And the third priority is, of course, to get rid of the masses of European regulation that affects British businesses. It stops them from operating effectively, it stops them from being able to grow and to expand and to employ people. And I really don't see why any of this is necessary. We have bananas limited to 14 centimetres. They have to be more than 14 centimetres. Personally, I have no problem with bananas shorter than 14 centimetres. It just seems to be completely ludicrous, some of this legislation.
Thank you. And let's come back this way to Neil. What do you think our aims and priorities should be?
So, my personal views for Labour's priorities, I'm sort of mainly thinking about what we should really aspire to defend if we leave the European Union. I have discovered 6 elements of EU membership that I really think are very important for us. One of so workers' rights. We do get a lot of quite important rights from the EU. I am very concerned that as soon as we leave our government right now, I do feel like they aren't as passionate about that as, say, other political parties like Labour. And I do feel like the EU is the EU's workers' rights would very much prevent any abuse in that sense. Second one, like environmental regulations, also very important. I'll go for all of them. The free movement of people. I do think personally that, over thinking about this a lot, I don't think we can avoid having free movement of people at the end of the day. Especially, as I'll say what Rachel said before, it's the main reason of that is with what's going on in our situation with Northern Ireland. If we don't have free movement of people between the EU, that could end up having a hard border between Northern and Southern Ireland, and that, I don't think anyone really wants that, especially in Ireland, especially Northern Ireland, which I believe didn't vote to leave the EU. So, I don't think that should be imposed on part of the United Kingdom. And then, human rights, also very important. And then I'll just say science, research funding, and transnational innovation. They are my main priorities when it comes to protecting, when we're negotiating the EU. Thank you.
Okay, and Chris, what do you think our aims and priorities should be as we go through Brexit?
I think that really we should have 2 priorities. First of which is to be a properly global Britain instead of just being closed in with the EU. And the second thing is to repair the damage that the EU has done, not just to our economy, but a society, as has been seen during the referendum campaign. One of the points that has already been touched upon is the free movement of people. I may just remind the people over there that we're not part of the Schengen zone, and we still have a soft border between the Republic and Northern Ireland. So the idea that leaving the EU would somehow create a disruption to the peace in Northern Ireland is nonsense. But, I think, we should always look for a free trade deal, but at the end of the day, if our future is not really going to be in the EU, we should be looking at the rest of the world instead. And given the German and French hostility towards Brexit, they still can't get over the fact that we voted to leave. It's likely we'll end up with no deal at all, so whatever effort people put in at the minute is not really worth it. I think any deal that involves us handing over vast quantities of money is also not a deal that is in our interests, because it's like entering a nightclub and having paid the drinks for 44 years, and then suddenly when it's time to leave the club, the guy on the door smacks you on the back with a massive bill that you can't afford. And I think, Trump has called the EU recently a vehicle for Germany, and has rightly criticised them for being very protectionist, rather. I think the EU is doomed to fail on that basis, and we should run far and fast away from them.
Thank you, Chris. Let's go back down to Damian. What are our aims and priorities?
I'm glad the Northern Ireland question has come up, because it was something that, to the Leave referendum campaign shame, was never brought up, because it's so integral to Britain and what Britain is. But the problem is how do you square the circle in the fact that we want to still maintain the status quo, as it were, in Northern Ireland, because I don't think anybody wants to start bringing that up again, because it's a very, very dangerous area, and the current status quo seems to benefit the most amount of people, as Jasmine would say, and Emmanuel Cannon, for that matter. But the immigration issue as well, because that's obviously a huge reason, I believe, that a lot of people vote to leave the European Union. It matters to a lot of people, and I know it's on the agenda later about looking at what solutions should we take, how should we conduct ourselves as Britain, should we join the EFTA? Well, the EFTA holds the ACOS, which is the term for most of the European policies people are familiar with: freedom of movement, freedom of goods, free movement of services. My only suggestion really is that there is a bit of flexibility in the EFTA arrangement, because Switzerland, while a member of it, isn't a member of the EEA, European Economic Area. So there might be something we can do there. The only question is this something that the British government wants to stare in the face? Because it's all very well, I think, being idealistic and saying what I believe or what someone else on the panel believes, but we have to look at the actual state of things, and it's going to be how will the Conservative Party conduct itself, what will it say? I don't imagine they're going to go for an EFTA agreement, because the press, especially some of the more aggressive tabloids, we can all name a few, are going to heap mounds of political pressure on them and say that they've sold out and that they're still in favour of Romania. Now, that could be true. There's people like Damian Green in the cabinet who do not seem to me to be even interested in leaving the European Union. Has not really voiced any pro-leave arguments, or even expressed any sort of understanding of why one might have wanted to leave. So, whatever I might think, I don't think the British Conservative Party, and this will be something that Scott is immediately going to talk about when he gets the chance, about what their plan is and how they see it, because my guess is they're going to go for a no-deal Brexit, as people like to say. It's a horrible word, but yeah, they're to you, Scott.
Yes, I think quite right.
Well, should we go to Ben first? Then we'll have Izzy, and then we'll...
Thank you. The aims and priorities are obviously economical, cultural, you know, obviously the United Kingdom doesn't want to break its cultural bonds with the European Union. It just wants to break its political bonds. I think that a deal would, or the priorities would be that you have to stay, it's very difficult to do free trade agreements with every single country. There has to be some sort of, like David said, an EFTA, a financial deal to make sure that post-2019 there is a transition period of certainty, because what's scary is that a no deal, what could it mean? It could mean, you know, obviously WTO rules, but it's funny because obviously we can't say it, we don't know. I don't even think David Davis knows what's happening. I think he's just got a blank paper, and obviously every time I say we're not going to agree to this, he just writes it down and says, I'm going to say this. It's alarming, and I think we can only generalise. I think cultural, economic, fiscal, and obviously fisheries and agriculture are one of the main points of obviously main points of interest for the United Kingdom.
Excellent. So, is anyone from the audience or the panel want to? Yep, let's go here first. Just wait for the mic to get to you. We've got a microphone.
So I have a question for you, Scott, about the trade deal that you said we could set up with South Korea and places such as like places in Africa, for example. Are you currently aware that the EU has already a trade deal in place with South Korea? It is currently the 9th biggest trade partner with the trade deal with the European Union currently, that provides a net surplus of 3.1 billion euros in 2016.
I wasn't aware of that, but thank you for making me aware of this. I don't really see what the point is. My point is more that South Korea has a lot of trade deals, and it can trade freely with hundreds of countries around the world, and that's the situation that I want the United Kingdom to be. Well, we're not in that position because the European Union doesn't have that many free trade agreements with the rest of the world. At the time of the European referendum, I believe they only had 3 with countries outside of Europe, but feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on that.
No, we had another question, let's go with that one first. Just down for him. They should?
So with regards to no trade deals, you must surely then you're definitely not aware that the EU on its website has a list of all the trade deals that it has with other countries such as around the world. You may be aware of Canada, the CETA deal, the current deal that's heading in with Australia, Japan. There's also trade deals with countries in Africa such as Cameroon, Botswana. There is also
sorry, these aren't free trade deals.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are.
Sorry, the deal with Canada hasn't happened yet. Lots of these are only very specific deals with maybe specific industries.
Can you let me answer?
I think another thing we've not yet come across is identifying what the European Union is and why we've left it, and what about it we didn't necessarily like. There were some things we might say were better than others. In reference to the South Korean point that the gentleman made in the audience, one of the reasons a lot of people want to leave the European Union and still do is because it's seen as a very sluggish, cumbersome technocracy. And I would like to ask, that was the latest trade deal that the European Union made, and I would like to ask you and anyone in the audience if they can tell me what year that trade deal was signed.
2016.
11.
16. That was provisionally signed in 2016.
Can I just raise a point here? Ultimately, the global world doesn't need Britain. It's one of those points that's made again and again and again. The Chinese, the Russians, the Americans have made it repeatedly clear to Britain that if you leave the EU, we are at the back of the queue. Unlike the Dutch and the French, whose empires shrank away contemporaneously as Britain's, they saw the value of the EU because they saw that the EU gave them power and strength in numbers. Because of the Second World War and the Falklands War, where the outcome was positive for us, we haven't had to face this loss of self-resistance
I'll just say, you said strength in numbers, why don't any of those states you've mentioned have a common economic policy?
The economic policy of the EU is designed to benefit all member states. But why would a country like South Korea, who's negotiating with 27 countries acting as one, then do a trade deal that's beneficial for the UK with the UK? We are an island of 70 million people. We are facing off against a trade bloc of 540 million people. Ultimately, they have a voice which is a magnitude louder than the British can project. And we don't have anything that we can necessarily offer those in the South Koreans or the Mexicans or the Cameroonians more than the EU can offer them. We are at the back of the queue.
Should we go to the other audience question first?
Hi. In regards to your example, I believe your name is Scott, correct? With Algeria, you are aware that Algeria is part of its continental trade union, the African Union, yes? The body controlling it. And African Union right now is pushing for more trade within Africa. That is the big incentive initiative that they're going after. And they're hoping by 2030 to increase trade by quadrupling amongst African countries. So you're seeing the rest of the world becoming more interconnected with their local partners, and you think you are going to somehow just jump on and immediately start making trade deals with countries that have more pressing matters to deal with. Why would Algeria, for example, be looking for a trade deal first and foremost with the UK as opposed to 28 other countries combined? How would that make sense on their part?
They could have both free trade deals, couldn't they? There's no reason why they can't have a free trade deal with the European Union and a free trade deal with the UK. But I think it is definitely in Algeria's interest to have a free trade deal with the United Kingdom, because it's in their interest to be able to export their products for the highest price possible and grow their own economy. It's also in their interest to be able to buy certain products that Britain manufactures and services, crucially, from the United Kingdom.
Chris had a point, so
can I just say that, this idea of being at the back of the queue for all these trade deals is absolute nonsense. The only person who ever said that we would be at the back of the queue is Obama, and now that Trump is in, he's said that we'd be at the front of the queue, essentially. And actually, there's 105 countries that want a free trade deal or deeper trading relations with the UK. They include Australia, Brazil, Canada, Chile, China, Colombia, Ecuador, Germany, Ghana, Iceland, India, Ireland, Japan, Kenya, South Korea, all of those countries. Right, so it's not like no one wants to trade with us. This idea that somehow we're going to be isolated in the world is simply nonsense. And bearing in mind as well, what we actually left behind to get into the EEC was the Commonwealth of Nations, which had been heavily neglected and wrongfully upon our entry of the EU. And I think, if anything, we should actually start developing them as modern economies that are fit to trade with us.
Okay. We'll do the last audience question before we move on.
In all of this talk about being part of the EU, everyone's highlighting the benefits of being part of the European Union. I don't know anything about economics. I'm a builder. I'm an economist around here. But if you do a quick Google, Financial Times in September 2017, Poland is threatening to block a part of the EU's trade deal with Canada, blah. So we're making these trade deals with other countries, but at the end of the day, you've got 27 votes to contend with for this one trade deal. Because England versus Russia, it's just England and Russia in that conversation, rather than 27 other people to contend with, with their ulterior motives going into this EU trade deal. Everyone's in it for themselves. I know that's not the concept of the EU, but Poland has got their intentions imposing on a European trade deal. Not being in the EU means that it's just us, not Poland and Russia and all these other countries involved. That's what I have to say.
The biggest issue that you've got with UK standalone by itself is probably best represented by the framework being posited for the NHS. There is a mooted agreement that has been between America and Britain, where if there was a potential American trade deal with the UK, that there would be a massive privatisation of NHS services, because the Americans do not want to see a socialised medical system in the UK potentially competing against what the Americans are offering. The biggest benefit of being a part of the EU, yes, there are 28 separate voices, but those separate voices are a bit like a union, like a trade union, where one person by themselves can speak into the wind and they're not really heard. 28 voices, or 28 million, or 540 million voices. Yes, they have disagreements, and yes, there are major problems, systemic problems in the EU, but by speaking as one voice, China can listen, America can listen, Russia has to listen, because you have, comparatively, the fourth or fifth biggest population bloc in the world is within the EU. And therefore, by trading with that bloc rather than an individual country, they're all stronger for it, and they can get a better rates in manufacturing for goods and services. And ultimately, it benefits all members of that society, rather than, if you're outside of that, any trade deal between a larger nation and a smaller nation will automatically benefit the larger nation, because that is in their intrinsic self-interest.
Okay, let's now move on to a question about sovereignty. So, is Brexit a message to a global order or globalism? Before I take it to the panel, I'll just remind the audience that if you do want to speak, just stick your hand up at any point and I'll allocate time for you. So let's start this time with Ben on sovereignty.
I think it's quite funny because when obviously you all see in the newspaper frontline, enemies of the people. I think it's quite funny how people who are democratically elected, whose constituencies by and large voted the way they have voted, saying that these people shouldn't do it because the whole of the United Kingdom voted to leave is quite absurd. I think that, like with Ken Clark's constituency of Rushcliffe voted to remain, so why not? Why can't he express the views of his constituencies, which he's perfectly allowed to? Obviously he's not going to express the views of Gibraltar, even though they voted to remain. He's not going to say, well, obviously I need to obviously show the views of another part of the United Kingdom. I think that sovereignty is happening. I think it's the EU referendum is kind of taking over, saying, obviously the UK Parliament, the House of Commons being the primacy, was not sovereign. It was just by and large good policies being used. Obviously, the UK Parliament could veto and not reject some of the policies that the European Union has created. But I think that now with the constant, what's her name, Gina Miller, who actually took it to court, it strengthens the Commons for a politics student who's doing a dissertation on the Commons. I think it's great because it strengthens the Parliament and it strengthens our constitutional democracy.
Thank you. Let's go now to Damian. Do you think Brexit is a message to the global order and or globalism?
Yeah, I think a lot of people that vote to leave would suggest that they're not quite happy with supranational authorities and integrated economies. But at the same time, there needs to be somebody that needs to say that we can't live in this, how should I say, sedated pre-Civil War state of affairs that we have in Britain now. There was 48% of people voted to remain, and while I suggest we should leave the European Union for many reasons, there needs to be some acknowledgement. Someone needs to put their hand out and accept that there's about half of the country that fundamentally disagrees with them on, I think, one of the most fundamental questions of our age, because the European Union has forced us, the referendum forced us to ask us questions about our identity, who we are, the historical philosophy of the United Kingdom, mainly, and the long-term divisions that have been in Britain for a long time. So we start with the Saxon Norman yoke, a huge body of literature. So a lot of it's quite fun to read, actually, talking about how there's a fundamental difference in Britain between, and it's always split half and half, and there's always a bit of a dialect there. It's quite funny. And then we have the forward, sorry I'm giving you a history lesson, we fast forward to the Civil War, and we've got the more Puritan Protestant philosophies of J.S. Mill, Berkeley, and then we've got the more European philosophies in Britain, because as John de Gaulle said, we're a mongrel nation, and we should always, and our language is mongrel. There's many sources from Low German to Latin, for example, and the reason we speak. That's why I think it's the language of the world. But there needs to be someone who puts their hand out and addresses that there's a very deep divide, and that's why I think the European Free Trade Agreement situation is probably going to be the most beneficial, because there are always going to be people that want to remain in the European Union, and there's deep philosophical evidence for their position, as there is for the opposite side. So we need to understand this, and the European Free Trade Agreement, and maybe work out, like I said earlier, something out on immigration, maybe have more reinvigorated checks at the border, something like that. Because as far as people are concerned now, there is no control. The Home Office can never account for the people that are coming here. So yeah, I'd say that the European Free Trade Agreement, with a caveat on it, of course, because it's not going to suit anybody's interest completely, would probably be the best way forward.
We've got a question, so let's jump in.
Okay, so just my question to you on the point of like immigration. Like you're saying that we have no control over it whatsoever. Are you currently aware of the EU law of Article 6?
I'm saying it's a feeling that people feel.
What is Article 6 then?
What, Article 6 of the European Union?
Yes,
well,
the
security checks. Yeah, well,
it's a free movement law.
What, the Acme laws?
Yes, the Article 6
in the Lisbon Treaty. What do you want to do? I haven't got.
Do you know what it is? I'm asking.
No, I know what it is, but I can't.
What is it?
What is it? I can't cite the whole thing. I know it's part of the Acme laws in the Lisbon. Well, you've got a phone on you.
I know what it is, but do you know what it is?
What's the articles? You want me to be able to cite the legislation word for word?
Okay then, so the free, not word for word, but I can sort of indirectly quote, the Article 6 law is the free movement law, which states that any European citizen can move across any EU state country for a maximum of 12 weeks. If you wish to stay longer than that, you have to prove that you are in work, in education, and are able to sustain yourself without relying on the state's welfare system. If you cannot prove any of those three criteria, you have to leave. And that is fully enforceable by the UK government, which they are fundamentally not doing and have failed to do over the last 7 years.
That's what my point was, that people don't feel that the British government is quite up to the task of immigration and monitoring immigration and being thorough about it. That was my point.
So what does it have to do with Brexit and the European Union?
That people feel that the policy is unrealistic and can't actually be maintained by the UK government.
But they can.
But you just said it could.
We are going to move on now. Let's go now to Chris on sovereignty and his Brexit message to globalism and the global order.
So I think it was definitely a vote against the worst parts of globalisation. So the multinational corporations, the big banks, the world's richest have literally nothing to gain from us leaving the EU, whereas the poor, the poorest in society, whose two biggest expenditure items are food and clothes, they will see their living standards increase as we get more competitive trade deals, the price of goods and services will fall. And I think, Brexit was a vote also against EU neoliberalism. It's quite surprising that there's so many people who voted to remain and therefore support the EU's neoliberal policies who don't like neoliberalism at home. And then they protest the government of the day here when actually they should be protesting the EU. Because it's the EU that that is assisting, certainly, in the privatisation of the NHS and all of the other services, public services that is, because it has an anti-monopoly clause which extends to state services. And let's not forget as well that the EU wants to build an army of its own. Now, why does the EU need an army? We don't know. Considering that one of its founding purposes was actually to prevent war in established peace, there is certainly no reason to have one. I strongly suspect that they're going to find something wrong with Russia, and they're going to try and attack Russia with that EU army. But I don't think they'll get very far when they're £13 billion short every year, so that's a pretty good thing. I think, like, in terms of what we gain or lose, we actually gain control of our laws, our economy, our immigration, our borders, our trade arrangements, our public services. Pretty much everything that the EU stole from us in 1973 will be returned to us. And, well, you say rubbish, but prove me wrong then. Prove me wrong. You know, all of these, I'll just make a final point. Like, all of these businesses and banks that are threatening to relocate their headquarters into the EU are full of hot air because none of them have actually relocated. And secondly, even the BBC had to concede that, quote, London would still be by far the largest financial centre in Europe, and the UK would still enjoy a healthy trade surplus in financial services with the rest of the EU, worth many tens of billions of pounds. So even if the banks passport their rights, lose the passporting rights over the EU, even with the worst of deals, or no deal at all, we would still be better off. We'd make up the difference elsewhere.
We're going to go now to Scott. What do you think of Brexit? And is it a message to the world order?
Well, I think it was a reaction in a way to the vote leave was a reaction to globalisation from some people, but people have many different reasons to vote leave. Just as many people have many different reasons to vote for Remain. A lot of people voted leave because they didn't like David Cameron and he was voting Remain. A lot of people voted leave because it was a simple matter of practicalities. They didn't like being a member of an undemocratic union. That was the main reason why I voted to leave. The European Commission is not democratically elected, nor is the Council of Ministers, nor are any of the ECJ judges. The European Parliament is the one sort of democratic body in the European Union, and it doesn't have much power at all, because the other three bodies take all the power. So I'm very pleased that people we elect will be making laws within the United Kingdom now, and we won't have these unelected people making laws on our behalf. We should get a say in how our country is run. And I think it's completely wrong that these unelected bureaucrats, who quite often have never had any experience meeting members of the public like members of Parliament do every week, these people are making our laws. But hopefully they won't be for much longer.
Yep, and now Rachel. Yep, I'll come to you after this.
Can I just make an observation here in regards to constitutions and unelected representatives? We live in a country with no written constitution. Ever since Magna Carta, we've had this free-flowing idea of what democracy has evolved into. It wasn't until the 1930s we had full vote for women, and that was because women fought for it. We've also got a situation where the majority of our country is not run by politicians. Politicians are a veneer on our democracy. Our country is run by civil service. So the whole idea, the whole argument of reclaiming power from Brussels is a fallacious one, because all you're doing is swapping one bureaucracy for another. The civil service is supposedly a meritocracy, yet how is it that the majority of high-level members of our civil service have gone through Oxbridge and Red Brick universities? It's very difficult to progress through the civil service if you have not got an Oxbridge education. You talk about the voting in terms of the EU, in terms of sovereignty. Cornwall, Wales and Northern England all voted out, yet they are the regions within the UK who benefit the most from EU funding. You talk about regaining sovereignty, you talk about bringing back money into the UK. Ultimately, Brexit is a sundering of hope and prosperity for all, because ultimately, where the money is going to be found from to pay for all of this will come from VAT, which will no longer go to Europe, but will still be taxed on goods and services. Who pays the most VAT? It is the poorest in this country who pay the most VAT. The big corporations are going to be offered the UK as a tax haven to keep them within the UK. Today, Caroline Lucas tweeted Ken Clark's comment. Ken Clark hit the nail on the head. The reason why the government is trying
The country with the lowest tax rates in the European Union is Ireland, not Britain.
Okay, but ultimately, the government is trying to delete the European Charter of Human Rights from UK law because if it doesn't, the Telegraph and its ilk will froth at the mouth at the fact it contains the words European and rights. Yet, the government is saying that when we repatriate European law back to the UK, they're going to want to do a line item as per Henry VIII's legislation. So it's going to be ministers, not Parliament, who dictate what laws are brought back to the UK.
I don't know why there's this air of venom in the room.
Oh,
if I could speak for a minute.
Let's let Rachel finish her point and then we'll come back for rebuttals.
I'd like to wrap this up with a nice bow on the top. Tory Brexiteer Sir Edward Lee said in respect of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights actually undermines rights. He said many of us think that the advancement of the European so-called human rights has been at the detriment of the rights of other people, particularly religious people, to find their own space. When we retain or regain parliamentary sovereignty in this House, our democracy, we can start assessing what real human rights are.
Yeah, very comparable.
Basically, what is being said is the rights that are being retained are going to be for the minority of wealthy people in this country. Austerity has already hammered much of the poorest people in this country, the disabled, the homeless. LGBT people who are put on the streets are being affected by this. Ultimately, Brexit will be a bonfire of EU legislation which is designed to mitigate the worst excesses of Tory passions. Ultimately, what we are seeing with Brexit is a long, plaintive howl in the night, a message seen by the world of desperation, a spasm against global order that has long moved on from Britain and its former empire. We're not going to be a sovereign nation at the centre of world order. We're going to be on the periphery because the world has long got past the idea of Britain and its empire. Thank you.
So, Rally, all of the things that you said, of which there were lots, all of those things may be true. And I think a lot of them would. But the question is, I don't think to some people, when the sky broke to some people, and they realised that all of that could be achieved, or at least it could be fought for on the national level. There is an element of fear of the Conservative Party for various groups in Britain, and I understand that. But that doesn't necessarily equate to remaining in the European Union. I've never understood why Britain, which was invented, or at least discovered philosophically, human rights through the works of Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke, the great underpinnings for human rights, what was called the rights of man at the time. So this is the country that discovered human rights and has a history of liberty, the 1688 Bill of Rights, for example.
This is a country that denied LGBT rights right up to the present day. We're a country that only gives rights when they're pressed to give rights.
Yeah.
If we're not pressed to give rights, then rights will not be given. It's only through protest, only through sabotage, only through terrorism that rights have been granted in Northern Ireland.
Well, actually, no, because if you understand where your own side of this debate comes from, the left, and I'm sure you'll know.
I didn't say I was on the left side. I tried on both sides of the political spectrum.
You hardly might know. If you understand the Fabian Society, which was active, and still is active, but in a small number because it's more or less achieved its goals. It was the first body in the whole of Europe and Britain which understood that revolution, you talk about revolutionary tactics and protest tactics being the only way, and you say that if we were a civil society we shouldn't have to fall on such things. Would you agree with that? No, it's part of it.
Can we wrap this up because we've got a couple of audience questions?
I was saying, you said that the fact that groups have to fall on revolutionary tactics and protest tactics is a sad state of affairs, and we're not a civil society if we have to use those things. Well, again, it was Britain and the Fabian Society and the democratic left, a voice which I think has been trampled by a new revolutionary left in British politics, that is prevented such. We have the Fabian Society, born out of that was the Labour Party. So there is a way in which these matters can be handled. You don't have to try and... You can paint the Tory party actually to be quite sadomasochistic sometimes. I think there are instances where that's happened. But to throw a million different points in the air and expect us to be able to deal with them isn't really going to help anything. Because Britain has always had a democratic left, and it's always fought for civil rights. Thomas Paine, who I mentioned a minute ago.
But you're missing the right. You're talking about the left.
Can we leave this?
Why
just for now?
and also, why can't we do this nationally? Why can't we agree as brethren that we believe in human rights?
We've got a few comments.
As if this came from the European Union out of the sky like a big UFO.
Can we start back here? You want to comment? More questions? No. We had.
So you talked about the EU army and they want the EU army. So if we assume that the European Union doesn't die eventually, since they've got a national anthem, they want an EU army, they've got Europol, they've got basically all the things you need for a nation state.
Yeah, why does it want to become a nation state? Why would they get rid of our identity and impose that rubbish on us?
I'm not disagreeing with you, just let me get to
They are.
I am finished, Chris.
that they will slowly turn themselves into the United States of Europe.
I'm sorry, I didn't get it.
What do you think the chances are that they will slowly turn themselves into the United States of Europe?
That is already happening, based on the evidence that you've literally just provided.
That end of it was just to everybody.
We've just said they have a national anthem,
Yeah.
they're building an army, they've got all the facets of a nation state.
Yeah.
They're cycling the power to the multinational corporations and stripping it from, obviously, the states that are in the EU, absorbing it into the EU Parliament and all the legislature of that. You've essentially just...
Can we? Yeah, what I'll do is we'll take the rest of the questions, then I'll go along the panel and maybe they can work your answers to the questions into our arguments. So we've got a couple down here. Let's go through first. Oh, yeah, Mo did ask first.
Hello again. This is another question for Scott. I see that you criticise the EU for being undemocratic, correct? You believe that they're lacking of all democratic institutions, a lot of unelected bureaucrats running the show. Okay, fair enough. But then, can you explain the undemocratic nature of the Tory party itself as well, and how it's been dealing with Parliament in the way it doesn't want to involve them in negotiations? Or earlier, when you guys opposed the ATV, the alternative vote, where that would have made the country a lot more representative and would have even broken the two-party system, most likely, but you also opposed that. So you're criticising them for being undemocratic, whilst steadfastly holding on to your own undemocratic traditions. How does that make sense to you, and how do you reconcile these two different factors in your mind?
I'll let you work that in a minute, but if you pass your... if we go here, we'll get the questions first and then we can go to answers.
I was a little bit confused by the point made about you have to protest in order to be heard. I mean, think about student protests, for example. I know it's not a minority group, but we just went outside Parliament and went, yo, sort out our fees. If we had a problem with something going on in Europe, we can't all jump on the aeroplanes in Brussels and sort that out. So surely that we can just protest at home is great. But I wasn't quite sure if I understood that point. My other point was VAT. So like, obviously we had a recession, shit went down, everyone was paying more. But that happened last year in the EU, and then things happened in Greece. We were like, yeah, let's bail out Greece, and then they're like, mate, they ain't paying that back. Like, that's not right, and that's all us being in the EU, so yeah.
We had someone else ask the question first.
You're talking about yourself, how the EU is not democratic as such. Obviously you're talking to Scott about how the Conservative Party is not democratic, but really the first step to becoming democratic will be first removing the hierarchy of the European Union, then we can focus on our own democracy. Personally, Switzerland is a fantastic system. Every couple of months, every citizen gets a letter in the post and they vote on about 100 different things. So this could be the first step to an actual more democratic United Kingdom. Now we've done that.
Okay, the audience, there's a Barney. Mo. Oi. We're going to go with Neil now first, because he has to say on sovereignty, and is Brexit a message to the global order and globalism?
So yeah, going back to that question, I think that was the intention of a lot of people who did vote for this election. You can see there is the swing of populism, if you want to call it that, in a lot of the West. You can say that to Brexit, that was a vote a lot of people said against the global elite. You can say about Donald Trump, a lot of people said that. You can see in a lot of European countries. Germany, for instance, they just elected a very far-right country. They got about 90 seats in their last election, and they're also Eurosceptic. It's quite ironic that one of the big international trends now is isolationism. So yeah, I think a lot of people are intending that to be the case, but I don't think the outcome is going to end up being to benefit the people who voted leave the end, which is, I feel like we definitely should respect the vote, and I feel like we should try to make it as good for those people as possible. But I think a lot of the problems that people were protesting during the election weren't mainly problems with Europe. They were problems that were self-imposed by our own government, and a lot of the times weren't really to do with Europe. They just wanted to show their anger at the Prime Minister, because a lot of people knew if we left the EU, David Cameron would go. I also do want to go back to your point a while ago about neoliberalism and how a lot of socialist policies probably wouldn't be able to happen in the EU. So I'd like to start with France. I'm pretty sure they have nationalised railway. So nationalisation can happen within the EU. And then Norway, I guess, sort of they've got like a semi-in-out deal with the EU. They've got a good trade deal, and they've got a nationalised bank as well. So I feel like socialist policies can happen within the EU. It isn't impossible. So I just wanted to make that point. But I do feel like overall, people wanted this to be a process where a lot of people did vote for genuine reasons as well. But I don't think those were necessarily the people that won the vote. I think it was the process vote that really tips the scale into us leaving the EU. I just wanted to say that.
We are running slightly behind, so I'm going to cut out a question here and go straight onto the matter of the economy. So what does Brexit mean for the economy? And should the European funding to the UK be matched with things like the farmers getting paid properly and business funding? Let's start with Chris on this one.
Okay, so essentially,
Or here's the question to you. Think if you feel are relevant.
well, I don't think any of them were aimed at me. I think there's a lot of people in the audience that have a gripe at the Tory party itself, as opposed to what the issue is with this debate, which is Brexit. I think like all of the doom and gloom stories that have been going around about Brexit have been completely proven wrong. There was that dishonest Treasury paper of May 2016 which stated, quote, "A vote to leave would represent an immediate and profound shock to our economy. That shock would push our economy into a recession and lead to an increase in unemployment of around 500,000. GDP would be 3.6% smaller, average real wages would be lower, inflation higher, sterling weaker, house prices would be hit and public borrowing would rise, compared with a vote to remain." Right. Well, there was no recession, nor any immediate sign of a future recession. Unemployment has actually fallen from 4.9 to 4.3% since then. House prices did stall, but are now growing again. GDP has continued to grow. Public borrowing has actually gone down by a third since we voted to leave. The currency has been in a bear market since mid-2014. If you actually look at the economic statistics, you'll see that the crash in the value of the pound after we voted to leave was part of a longer term trend, but is actually now rising in value again. Higher inflation has occurred, but that is really compensating for the period of very low to negative inflation that we had in the period immediately before it. And yes, average wages are lower as a result of that, but part of that could be down to government policy itself and not Brexit.
Thank you. And now back to Neil. What do you think? What does Brexit mean for the economy, and will European funding to the UK be managed?
What does Brexit mean for the economy? So the simplest answer to this is we have no idea. We have to do 2 years of trade deals, and it will 2 years of negotiation with the EU, if we get a good deal, hopefully that will limit what happens, and then hopefully make deals with other countries. But as we have said before, one country as opposed to 24 countries, like, okay, we have a lot to offer, but which one would you really choose at the end of the day? But I think what we really have to do is, through like Brexit, our aim has to be a better country out of it. But if that doesn't happen, what is the point? Like, there are other reasons to leave, but we can't shoot ourselves in the foot. We can't end up losing money out of this. And I think you were saying before about how things aren't as bad as the Treasury said they are. We haven't left the EU yet. We haven't lost our trade deal yet. A lot of the times, the other things you talk about how the Treasury, what was I going to say now? The Treasury is also in charge of a lot of our money policies as well. So if they're wrong in this, and then they're taking full control at the same time, like, it's still not great. Because I think we haven't left the EU yet. We don't know if, like, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how bad it's going to be. We could end up in a recession. And then we have to do everything we can to avoid all of this from happening.
Yeah, let's go across the bed now. Maybe you can also put a thought into what Brexit means to the trade deficit that the UK currently has.
I think it's obviously during the EU referendum there's that massive red bus that says take back control and you get we can spend £350 million a week on the NHS. I mean, that was obviously a lie. I mean, none of us here worked for a vote. I mean, except from David over there, he was Nottingham.
Yeah, I was the vote leave coordinator for Nottinghamshire. So, what an incredibly dreary job it was.
But that's the thing. You were accountable for that 350 million, and yet Nigel Farage.
I wasn't accountable because although you can justify it and say, well, it wasn't actually a political campaign, it wasn't actually going into government, and then it was phrased in a very suggestive way, and it said, and I do agree with you on a lot of this, it said, it says, well, we can't spend, so it was obviously written in a very persuasive way, and then people were obviously going to get very annoyed about it. I thought for that.
Bus. 350 million. Massive bus.
No, that's what I mean, but I could, if I had no sense of self-respect, try and get out of by saying it's not actually a political campaign. I think it was a bit, should we say, coy. I don't know.
This is the thing. Obviously, we are going to leave the European Union. That's a fact. So obviously we need to kind of debate afterwards. But the fact is that I don't think Theresa May will get the best deal for Britain. I don't trust Theresa May with 10 million, was it a billion? 10 million for the DUP?
What is a billion?
Yeah, but votes. She doesn't have a leg to stand on. Davidson hasn't produced the white paper yet. Yeah. There's no reports. That's the thing. I'm a realist. If Davidson, published a report saying this is what we're going to get this deal, and we're going to be, in the red.
This is what I was saying at the start. Is you have to look a lot of this through the lens of the British Conservative Party, because if you look at the history of the British Conservative Party, is although people that like to talk up tension on both the left and the right try and paint the Conservative Party into various corners. If you look at the Conservative Party's relationship with the European Union since the 70s anyway, it's always acted in a way towards Europe to save its own arse. There's never been any moral reason that they've ever employed to either be inside the common market or outside the common market. The only reason, because people always paint Margaret Thatcher as this big triumph, an anti-European Prime Minister. It wasn't until later years that she actually became anti-European, and the reason for that was because Jacques Delors, former president of the Commission in the 80s, made a speech that announced a social chapter, and by virtue of that, the Labour government, the Labour Party, the Labour Party completely reversed its position, because it was always anti-European. That great speech by Peter Shaw in the Oxford Union in the 70s, one of the great anti-European speeches, it's fantastic. But they realised that they could undo Thatcherism and the free market liberalism of Thatcher, which I think a lot of the time they made up because they went a lot, but they realised with the social chapter of the European Union, they could undo a lot of those policies by the back door. Fast forward towards John Major, who wanted to create a bit of distance between him and Mrs Thatcher, decided to be more pro-European, and then they joined the exchange rate mechanism, and we had the recession of 1992, and then after that we had a lot of grunge music and misery and rain.
I was going to say, because obviously I don't know if you want to ask this question, but Scott, do you feel that, because Theresa May was a Remainer, do you think that if she left and Philip Hammond then left as well, do you want Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, and then Michael Gove, Chancellor of Exchequer, a Brexit government?
Do you want to answer that when you come to answer this question also? But let's let's just do yours now. So Scott also talk about the economy, the trade deficit, and European funding.
I'll answer that question first. No, I don't think anyone wants to see Boris Johnson as Prime Minister. Theresa May is taking a pragmatic approach, and I think it's important. 48% of the country did vote to remain, and I think it is important that their views are considered. But of course, we do need someone that voted leave as Foreign Secretary and someone who voted leave negotiating the deal to make sure we get the best deal possible. And I think David Davis is probably one of the best politicians to do negotiation. The reason he hasn't said anything about the negotiation is because that would spoil his negotiating.
I was going to say, Theresa May just said she's going to give £80 billion to the European Union. That £80 billion could pay for 3.2 million nurses. And she's going to give that to the European Union.
That was a conditional offer on what it was. And they would have to give us a very good trading relationship in order to achieve that. So moving quickly back to the sovereignty question. You asked a question about the Tory party being undemocratic. The Tory party is not undemocratic. All of the internal workings of the Conservative Party are done completely democratically, and all of our MPs have to be selected through panels.
I asked you specifically about Brexit negotiations and your relationship to Parliament, as well as your opposition to ATP when it was put up by the Liberal Democrats. You opposed that. You have taken anti-democratic measures. So yes, within your own party, you decide who should be top dog and all of that, and all the backstabbing continues and everything. But outside of it, when it comes to dealing with the electorate, when it comes to dealing with the government and the rest of Parliament and the houses, you guys are not democratic in any way, shape or form. You criticise the EU for things that you yourselves wouldn't prefer.
The way the British government works is the largest party forms the government, and the Conservative Party are in government at the moment, so they are leading the negotiations on Brexit. That's just the way government works in this country. Someone asked if we were moving towards the United States of Europe. I think we are, Europe is, but very slowly, and I think it would take quite a long time to actually federalise the way the United States of America has. But moving on to the economy, I think Brexit will be terrible for the European economy. I think it will be brilliant for the British economy, because the European Union is going to lose the second largest economy, if you want to put it that way, the country that makes the second largest contributions to the European budget, and the largest financial centre within the European Union. So it's going to be awful. It's going to be a big hole in the government budget of the European Union. And countries like Poland, that currently receive a lot of money from the European Union, are going to be, they're still going to want their money. And countries like Germany and the Netherlands are going to have to stump up the funds to provide these transfers between countries. They don't want to do that, and there's probably going to be another election coming up in Germany soon. So it's looking like we might be in a position to get a very, very good deal with regards to don't think we'll be making big contributions to the European budget. Also, in terms of the economy, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I mean, to be honest...
I was going to help him out, just a quick point.
I'm going to come to you next if you want to bring your rebuttal in after that, after Rachel.
Okay.
Let her speech on what Brexit means to the economy, the trade deficit, and will European funding be managed?
Can I just say that David Davis and Theresa May, they live in a land called Cloud Cuckoo, and they're assuming that the 8% of EU trade that goes to the UK will somehow be a bargaining chip. The EU has got 92% internal trade within itself that can deal with and absorb whatever trade Britain's lost. In terms of banking, Frankfurt and Paris have already made agreements with major banking corporations, and there is potential for most of the major banks within the UK to transfer their headquarters to Frankfurt or Paris. And I appreciate that there'll be cost to that. Well, not according to the Guardian this morning, it wasn't. There's already several large banks already stated. Well, potentially. Now, in regards, just to clarify the point about the United States and Europe, my argument today is what is wrong with the United States and Europe? Nationalism, in terms of from the Napoleonic period onwards, has always been a very petty concept. All you have to do is look at German and Italian unifications to see how the idea of a dominant force unifying smaller political entities can be used for both good and ill. You just look at Bismarck in particular, and his philosophy has permeated across Europe, whether it be from the UK after the Second World War, or whether it be Germany pre the Second World War. And so in terms of sovereignty, is having the United States and Europe such a bad thing for European sovereignty? The USA, Russia and China have bigger land masses than the EU, and yet somehow we don't hear about each state in America suddenly wanting to become independent. Yes, there are muted.
The problem is culture.
Yes, it is culture, and I appreciate that.
They are full of Anglo-Saxons, that's what they are. It's us, we went over there and they had lots of kids and they were all Anglo-Saxons.
We'll come to the audience in a minute if you'll let me finish.
I mean, ultimately, when you look at the economy of Brexit, neither the USA or China is a reliable ally or model that the UK can follow. Both see the globe in transactional terms, which basically means that they give priority to their own national advantage. As Theresa May found out in 2017 with various meetings with the Premier Xi of China and President Trump, both are also dangerous for individual smaller nations to deal with. In such a world, the strengthening numbers of the European Union can matter very much indeed. In this context, as in many others, the madness of Brexit creates massive distractions from larger economic realities. It's also a big fantasy that the shape of Brexit can be solely fixed by Britain, and also in terms of an agreement strictly with Germany's Angela Merkel, who is at the moment facing a massive electoral challenge. You've got distractions in Spain, you've got distractions in France, with Macron facing demonstrations over socialist policies. All 27 EU countries need to agree on the final Brexit agreement, whether or not we crash out Brexit or we continue with it. That means that if there is no agreement between Ireland and the UK over the border, for instance, it will mean that the Irish veto any agreement and we crash out. Realistically, we have gone from a nation of shopkeepers, which is what Thatcher wanted, into a service economy, meaning that we are very dependent on global services to fund the economy we have. All this talk of employment, you're talking about employment since Brexit happened. Unfortunately, what that does not mention is that most of the employment in this country is low-paid employment. We've got higher levels. Regardless of whether Brexit or government policy, ultimately we're faced with an economy where you have low levels of wages with high levels of employment, which means that there is no growth potential in the economy. It is stagnating. In terms of house prices, you want a crash in house prices because the young people in this country, who are the potential wealth earners and wealth creators, cannot afford to go to struggle until they're 32. And all Brexit will do is re-entrench those economic inequalities that are faced by the young people who are at university, this audience here, and us on the panel. We are faced with the iniquities that have been entrenched by 40 years of neoliberalism, and that cannot just be addressed by 5 years of Corbynistic socialism. It needs to have a greater fix, or stay in the EU and work with the EU to fix that problem.
Okay, we'll now go on and finish run off a discussion with Damian and what you think Brexit means to the economy. Will European funding be matched? And what about the trade deficit?
Yeah, I'll try and sweep forward some of the questions. Gentlemen, you mentioned the Conservative Party being undemocratic, and Scott tried to spin it, but you are quite right that there's actually a constitution in the Conservative Party, but the members that are actually have any impact on that, and you know that. I mean, I know you're trying and justify it, but the Conservative Party isn't that democratic, is it, Scott? Come on. Like, and then the gentleman at the back, his question, who's bored, like he's been so long since I so we get someone got him. He talks about the European army and the United States of Europe, and that's one of the things I'm quite interested in, because I've studied, well, I'm not trying to brag, but studied nationalism and extremism, especially in Eastern Europe. And I'll just go through a quick history lesson. The notes are all scrambled, but I'm just going why we need to really think about this European common defence policy, and why we need to be very aware of the European army. And it was also funny how Rachel said in the middle that she brought Otto von Bismarck, and how the ideas permeated across the European Union or Europe. And it's quite true. They've got the book here. Where did you put the book, Scott? You put the book. This is the book here that is pre-1914 German foreign policy. It's right here. It's funny how much I'm going to say to the gentleman now rings true about this book, and how the European Union conducts itself with Russia. Because that's the real matter, because as Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote in his book, The Global Chessboard, he was a foreign policy advisor and lecturer. He talked about the Ukraine being what he called the biggest and most important real estate on the continent. And he said, the moment the Soviet Union collapses, the question is going to arise again. And this is why after the Berlin Wall, the United States was very, very quick to expand eastwards and quickly sign all these former Soviet satellite states up to NATO membership. There wasn't even a question about whether these nations ever wanted to have their own sense of self-determination, unfortunately. But anyway, so the EU offers an association agreement, which is a form of it's a preamble for accession of the Ukraine into the EU. I've read quite a bit of it, but it's over 2,000 pages of size 11 Calibri font, so you forgive me for not being able to talk about everything in it. And Russia responds with its own agreement, which I haven't read because I can't find an English translation of it, but the story is that Ukraine decided to accept that offer and remain in the Russian cultural sphere of influence. The clauses within the association agreement aren't just economic, they're political. As I said, it is essentially a form of accession. It's not just a cooperation policy as you would think from the name association agreement. Then Yulia Tymoshenko is removed for embezzlement in 2011, and then hang on, I'm going to make sure I do this right, so I don't want to go back on for ages. Yeah, so I go to the common security and defence policy is mentioned in the association agreement. Hang on. I'll quickly sum it up. There's about 6 different factors that are broken down in the 2,000 pages. A, to promote gradual rapprochement between parties based on common values and privilege links. And then there's gradual integration in the EU internal market. That's to transition the Ukraine into the EU free trade area by means of progressive approximation of its legislation to that of the Union. Again, I'll read it. A progressive approximation of its legislation to that of the Union. It's political integration, not economic integration. Enhanced cooperation in the field of justice, freedom and security. That's just vacuous Blairism. And then there's to establish conditions for increasingly close cooperation in other areas of mutual interest. Now, what are these matters of mutual interest? The European Union is very, very interested in Ukraine assessment because, as I said, as Damian Smith said, it's one of the most important parts of foreign policy. The European Union is now starting to conduct itself like Imperial Germany. It's starting to break away from the US foreign policy, which is a lot of what the European Union is founded upon. And what does Russia do? We need to think about this in terms of international relations. We need to look at Vladimir Putin. Think about it. He's a realist actor. He believes in self-determination and the right of a nation. That's why he ended Syria in the Civil War. And it's all good and well to talk and be high-minded about how the European Union cares about peace. But But if you continually push into a historical, cultural, economic, political sphere of influence,
we're not
and you're dealing with a character
the sphere of influence has dissipated in 1918 at the end of the First World War. I'm sorry, but
well, they invaded Ukraine in the First World War and in the Second World War, and they're trying to do it now. So I don't know how you can say it's not happening.
Okay, we've got questions from the audience, so we'll take those before we move on.
How will the EU help solve the housing crisis? It was an earlier question, because you said something about this. That was going to solve our problems. How exactly will the EU solve the housing crisis?
I mean, ultimately, the EU can solve a housing crisis by ensuring that the money that's needed for regions such as Cornwall, North Wales and Northern England can be provided, because the Tories have been cutting back the social fabric of this country for 3 generations now. And ultimately, the EU has been plugging the gaps. So, driving to Cornwall, there's a massive EU symbol on the Cornish saying welcome to Cornwall. There's an EU flag there. You wander around any town.
It doesn't count as a house.
Yes, it does, because what it counts as is money from the EU is being given to enable social projects that enable councils to spend the money on social welfare projects and houses.
Isn't a house, like, you can say the EU help Bruce Library. Bruce Library is great, I spent my whole life there, but I ain't a house. I'd rather buy a house than a library. That hasn't specifically gone into house. You say the EU helps
Chris had a point there, so we should go to Chris on this point.
Yeah. The EU, to afford for all this, to tackle social deprivation and everything, of the 13 billion that we put in, they give us 4 billion back. 4 billion is a scratch on the surface to what is a much deeper and longer problem than what we're trying to suggest.
Chris, I'll just add that if you look, the fact is, and you can't even argue this even if you are fair in the European Union, is that less than half of the European member states, and I can't recall all of them actually contribute to the European budget, the European Commission then redistributes that wealth from less than half of the states to all of the states. So even on a simple question of mathematics, you're never going to get the same money that you put in.
I mean, there's also the other factor as well, that housing is not just simply about building a house. Housing is in terms of what a council can provide for you, and what a housing association can provide you, and whether or not the council is building houses. If a council, in Nottingham in particular, Nottingham Contemporary is probably the best example of an EU project.
Well, I just want a house. I don't want an art gallery, I want a house to live in that way.
Yes, but if the council is not having to build art galleries and can put the money that they would have spent on an art gallery towards social housing, which is what they were doing, because Nottingham...
It's also the numbers. If you've got a million people coming, that's a million houses for every minute. That's another thing.
But that's a sovereign issue for the government of Westminster.
Europe is constant, yeah? If 10%, I'm not saying this is a number, 10% of people move, like, so there's more people coming to here than overall people leaving here.
Sorry, if it's in terms of immigration, there's a separate issue between housing and immigration.
And also, you mentioned the migrant crisis as well, and that gentleman made that point, and he thought he got a better way of...
We will move on to the migrant crisis.
I'm going to bring this up. He talked about the letter of the law about Article 6 of the Lisbon Treaty. So that's actually how it happened. I should mention at no point during watching any of the migrants come here was I...
Hang on.
See Article 6 being observed.
Okay, what was that, Rachel? Yeah, definitely. Yeah, fine statements. Should we have... we've got a bit of time to move on to the practicalities of Brexit before we do that. So is Brexit a result of ideology or pragmatism? Let's start with that.
Well, I think, as I said earlier, Brexit is a result of both pragmatism and ideology. How should we go forwards into the future? We should go forwards with a pragmatic approach. We should build barriers with the European Union just for the sake of it, just as we shouldn't destroy all barriers with the European Union just for the sake of it. We should create a sensible policy that is right for Britain. Really, I think we should try and get a relationship much like Canada has, or is getting to have, with the European Union. A free trade agreement, but no rights to move across borders, none of the regulation, none of the legislation, but still being able to trade in
I mean, ultimately, Brexit is a result of so much pent-up frustration at neoliberal policies enacted over 40 years from Margaret Thatcher to David Cameron. And it's both Labour and the Conservatives or the Democrats, all three parties have got a hand to play in it. And Brexit itself is very much based on the simple ideology of divide and conquer by the Conservatives because they couldn't get their own house in order, and UKIP in particular were putting pressure on them for the 2010 government, before the 2010 election, so they panicked. And David Cameron made a massive error of judgment by creating Brexit. So it's neither ideological or pragmatic, it's just a leap in the dark because David Cameron essentially couldn't stomach the thought of controlling his own party. On the flip side of all of that, Britain does need to be ruthlessly pragmatic about Brexit. You need to wash away all ideology. As I said, I'm pro-Remain, I will always be pro-Remain, I'm pro-European. But to make it work, we need to recognise that the only way Britain can survive outside of the EU is a unified nation of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England all coming together. And so it's not just the English spasmodic cry in the dark, cry in the wild, or Scotland and Ireland get rejected. Because ultimately Brexit is not a Scottish or Northern Irish or even Southern Welsh issue. It is the British and the Northern working class British issue in particular which caused Brexit to happen in the first place. We need to be a pragmatic partner in the world. And not just to Europe, but to all the other nations who wish to come to our doors. I personally would sincerely wish for a second referendum. I think that would be the best outcome given all the chaos that's been caused by the government. Otherwise, the party that's going to cause the major problems is going to be the DUP, because they will trip up any agreement if we end up with Northern Ireland being buttoned up and turned into a basket case over Europe, which is very likely if we end no agreement, because there will become a hard border overnight between Southern Ireland and Northern Ireland. Which means that any deal between the DUP and the current Conservative government is going to be moot. And so what you will see is flailing around by the Tory party to try and find some deal that can be palatable to enough MPs to push it through Parliament. But then what you will also see is 27 other EU nations trying to ensure that they get a slice of the pie that will inflict as maximum amount of damage onto the UK as possible. Therefore, are we going to see is Brexit pragmatic or ideological? Neither. It is just a cry in the dark.
David, I just can't say anything. What the fuck does ideological pragmatism mean? Because the audience don't probably know now. I've never heard it before. I don't know what it means. What does ideological pragmatism mean?
No, it's ideological or pragmatic. Ideology is in terms of...
ideological or pragmatic?
Neither.
Beg your pardon. Beg your pardon. Well, I'll carry on to it. Yeah, that was all mostly true. And again, as I said, you've got to look at it through the lens of the British Conservative Party. And one of the reasons I think a lot of people voted to leave again was because they don't really have much faith in government anymore. They don't have much faith in the Westminster model. They don't see any Conservative values being defended. I certainly don't. So I suppose it's what he's got to tell me around.
So should we go to Ben first before we do that? So what sort of ideology or pragmatism from your standpoint, what did you see of it?
I think it's the hatred of the French and Germans, really. Two World Wars, one World Cup, and also we're leaving the European Union. Obviously, Britain tried twice to join the ECC, and it didn't work. We got outvoted, well, we got rejected by the French. So it's kind of from the foundations, it's been a tricky relationship. It's like a relationship with obviously the divorce bill. So it's like an ex-wife who wants to keep seeing you. You just want to just go away. But it's people need to start thinking of. Okay, I think we need to get away from party politics. I think the only way Brexit can work is with cross-party, a good compromise on both the parties in Westminster and also the European Union. But it isn't like we're going to get a deal and then that's it. We are land masses. They're going to be there. It's a long way to America along the ocean. There's 500. Workers and buyers in the European Union. So it's still going to be there. It's still going to be our friend. And I think that it's obviously David Cameron chanced it and he lost. But I think why can't it? Why can't it be a good thing? Why can't we make the best of it? Why can't we make it work to Britain? Because if Britain's got it, it's keep calm and carry on.
Okay, Neil, what do you think about Brexit in terms of ideology and pragmatism?
I do think ideology had an incredibly large part to it for a lot of people who voted, both on the left and the right. I know a lot of socialists who voted to leave the EU for the reasons of like the EU being undemocratic, a lot of what was said before, but a lot of those I don't believe in. And then I do believe more overwhelmingly on the right, a lot of people believed, on the issue of immigration mainly. And I think a lot of the arguments with immigration were sort of very obviously. We saw the Nigel Farage poster of the migrants, and I do think that did end up having, whether we looked at it or not, that did have a very defining part of the EU arguments, and I think that was a lot of the ideology that caused us to leave the EU. So I would say a lot of it was ideology. What I would say about pragmatism is, Euroscepticism isn't necessarily pragmatic, but I think this was the way that this referendum was. We basically had a referendum that said, do you want to leave the EU? Let's ask the public. And then we have no backup plan, and we have no idea what's going to happen. Everyone's sort of like, a lot of the arguments that have been made, there's been a lot of like, quite complex economic arguments, which I'm not going to lie, like, I'm not an economic student, but we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen in 2 years' time. We don't know what the state of the world is going to be. And I think we have put ourselves in a hole where we have no idea where we're going to end up, which I don't think that is pragmatic at the end of the day. I think the Conservative Party, it's like a party of like, everyone's saying, oh, they're the ones who they don't take risks, like trusting with the economy, with the government, like, and stuff like that. And then they took this massive, ridiculous risk. They ended up putting their own party in a whole load of turmoil. Everyone knew that if Brexit, we want the Brexit vote was like won by like leave, David Cameron would have to leave, and then a lot of people then thought Boris Johnson would be probably the Prime Minister vote, but then due to certain things happening, now we have Theresa May. So like just a lot of rubbish has happened, and it all spans from the Brexit vote. And I just think that wasn't a pragmatic choice by the government. People might have voted for Brexit for pragmatic reasons, but at the end of the day, there was very little pragmatism that came into it.
Okay, let's finish this question with Chris. Pragmatism or ideology?
Well, firstly, I've got a thing or two to say about what's been said already. You constantly talked about strength in numbers. Well, how about this? 500 million Europeans or 7.5 billion people in the world who we can trade with. The second thing is, coming from a working class background, I voted to leave. Why would I have voted to leave? To make myself poorer? You know, I've got an A-level in economics, for God's sake. And I have here the Wetherspoons Manifesto. It's a coaster that I picked up. Just like Nigel Farage has his passport, I've got to love this. And it says the EU currently charges taxes on food imported from outside the EU. From March 2019, the government can and should eliminate these import taxes. This will result in a reduction in food prices. So, I mean, it's not just me who's saying that this is a pragmatic thing, it's businesses as well. It has a practical application, voting to leave and organising Brexit. I think, you know, in terms of a historical context and how we'll look back on this, I think it will ultimately be seen as pragmatic. You know, we must always put the needs of the people before the wants of any government. We must always put issues before ideologies, and Brexit, I think, is emblematic of pro-needs and pro-issues, and I think that spirit will continue. However, in saying that, I think that the Brexit betrayal has actually already begun, because the EU has made negotiations completely suffocating, and Theresa May is just not standing up to the EU in the way that she should be. Far from being an iron lady, she seems to be a tin can being kicked down complacency street. I mean, there's just absolutely nothing to it. In terms of like the knock-on effect, I think Scottish independence is now finished, because so is the SNP. I think the EU will actually collapse sooner rather than later. You see this materialising everywhere in the headlines. Polish president warns multi-speed EU will collapse, says the FT. Investor who predicted Brexit now says the euro will collapse, says the Spectator. Leaked German military documents detail plans in case of EU collapse, says, of all papers, the Independent. And I think what is currently unforgivable is that in the current circumstances we have a Prime Minister who voted to remain, delivering the will of the people who wanted to leave. We have a Prime Minister who's blaming everyone around her when she is at the heart of the problem herself. I think the ultimate upshot of this is Theresa May is finished, and in about the spring or summer of 2019, David Davis will be Prime Minister.
Okay, we're going to take a couple of questions from the audience and then try and work the answers into your closing statements.
Okay, so you're saying that, that with all the question of ideology and whatever, the entire campaign on both sides was sort of built on this idea that Britain is back to its empire time. So that imperial times, that's it. Thank you. That we don't have that actually collapsed in 1951. Because when we started to lose our stage on the world power, and then the biggest event was the Suez Crisis, where we could not sustain that part of a port that was in Egypt, and the US told us to actually get out. And then, so back to and then after a few years after that, we've started to apply to join the EEC. With the practicalities of Brexit, so Chris, you mentioned that the EU is making the talk suffocating. Well, it is we are the ones that are wanting to leave, and then we are asking them for all the benefits of staying in the EU whilst not being a member or paying a different part.
We have a right to leave, that is our right, and it is outlined in EU legislation. What on earth makes you think that having voted to leave...
Can we move on to other questions?
This is a question for everybody on the stage. On a scale from 0 to 10, 0 being completely impossible, 10 being complete metaphysical existence, what are the chances that we will be able to strike a trade deal with the United States?
Okay, are there any more comments from the audience before we move on to closing statements? Okay, so for closing statements, let's start with Neil. Any final thoughts on what's been said in the debate? Some of your side.
So closing statements. I think, so yeah, at the end of the day, we are leaving the EU, and I would like to see as much of success as we can. We will have these 2 years of trading agreements with the EU, and I hope we get a transition period. And I do hope that we do fix everything up. Although I do believe if we have no agreements and there is a stage where our country is in a bit of a mess, I do think we should be able to have a bit of a fail-safe. If we are going to go into a major recession and everything, all the evil that a lot of say the new European and stuff are saying is going to happen, why should we make our country worse than better? That is not what government is supposed to do. And if we do Brexit, to be fair, I would like to see the Labour Party negotiate it. I would trust them more than the Conservatives. All of them, really. I think that's a big thing. They will look out more for workers' rights, and they'll look out for the rights of all Europeans. So, Scott said before that, obviously the EU is going to make all the other European countries significantly worse off. I don't think we should be looking at it as a competition, or look how much better our country's doing, and look at all those poor people. That's not how we should look at the world, really. And I just think, hopefully, we'll become better than worse, I guess.
Ben, closing thoughts?
Yeah, closing thoughts. I'll be quick. I feel that I don't trust the Conservative government. I don't think that they will do the best deal for us. I don't think that it's right that they say, well, this is the only deal we can get and we're going with it. I think we are a parliamentary sovereignty. I think that Parliament should, it's difficult obviously then if they vote it down, whatever, but that's obviously to do with civil servants and they get paid far more money than they should do to figure all this stuff out. I think Brexit will happen. Brexit is going to happen. I feel that it's not all about financial. It's all about cultural stuff. Cultural joins and norms last longer than financial and economical differences.
Okay, Rachel, closing thoughts?
I mean, ultimately, I will stick by Europe. I appreciate there are faults in it, and I appreciate there are many, many issues to resolve. But, and I will reiterate what my colleague here has just said, the Conservative Party are leading us up the garden path. I promised not to talk about turkeys and Christmas, and I'm going to break that promise. The Tories are turkeys, they are leading us into the oven, and we are going to be well and truly cooked. The EU has no desire to give us an easy way out of the EU. They don't need to, they don't want to, and they're going to make it as painful and as hard and as bitter as they possibly can to ensure that the other 27 members of the EU do not leave. My head says that we are heading for a massive crash, that economically it's all well and good talking about trade deals, but until you've figured out how this force is going to happen, those trade deals are not allowed to happen legally. No country, America, Canada, Australia, etc., are going to touch us until we're out of the EU or until the agreement is set in stone, and that won't happen for 2 years. And at which point we are likely to be facing one of the toughest economic situations in this country, where stagnating wages and spiralling inflation are going to cause massive problems.
A lot of people, I think, can't fully understand at any given point what the European Union is. They can't even name their MEPs. They can't name. I challenge most people to name 5 Commission members. To be honest, I certainly couldn't name them all. But Immanuel Kant said something in his. It was a critique of pure reason. He talks about how we understand something, and the rationalists suggest that we do everything, we study everything objectively. But Immanuel Kant said that we can use our imagination to understand something, and that can help bridge the gaps in our understanding of any concept or given thing. And this is, I think, where the Remain side, we start to understand it, because Pete Hitchens said that the European Union debate and the 2 parties that represented us during the referendum would actually have more in common with the political divisions that exist in Britain now than the Labour and the Conservative Party do. I think that's true to some degree. With Kant's imagination philosophy, and I'm coming to about this. And I think there needs to be a case for the European Union to reduce its spending, which it doesn't seem to do because he wants to redistribute the seats that Britain has instead of cutting them off all those civil servants want to keep their jobs, of course. It's arbitrary to take 2 billion for the European Union to pay to leave. So people are being constantly proved right. The European Union is a self-interested technocracy.
Okay, we're really going to have to move on. We're running over. Chris, what are your closing comments?
I think that the working class are already hurting. I know I come from a working class background. I think the idea among many of the working class is that it can't get worse than this, and so whatever Brexit will do will obviously alleviate some of the problems we face. I think one of the sad things is that the social divisions this is exposed, not created but exposed, will take a very long time to remedy. With things going on such as, Germany had an election 2 months ago, it still doesn't have a chancellor. The EU collapse is now pretty much certain. I think it will be sooner rather than later, as I said earlier. You see the rise of the AfD in Germany, you see Trump's hostility to the EU. You see the potential for a new state being created in Catalonia. And you have, above all, the continued sheer arrogance and intolerance of those who are on the left of politics that are still angry because people are not believing their evil lies. And I think it is on that basis and on the distinctly destructive way in which the EU does its business, essentially, it will tear itself apart. And I think, the Brexit Bill Act won't happen for a simple practical reason, because it takes forever to get through the legislation and rewrite it. I don't trust the government as well, but it's much better than putting Jeremy Corbyn in that ministry to sort this stuff out, because he is a person who really doesn't want Brexit to happen. I think, like, if ever we did have a vote on the EU, currently, in the words of Paul Keating, who is one of my idols, political idols, if you don't understand it, don't vote for it. If you did understand it, you'd never vote for it.
Okay, and the final closing statement. Let's go to Scott.
So I think after we've left the European Union, there will probably be a few slight economic problems initially. The British government had already enshrined workers' rights into British law before we joined the European Union. So I don't really see how that's relevant. Obviously, we could rip up those rules, but I don't really see any reason to do so. I don't think it's in the Conservative Party's interest to do so. Then you said you didn't trust the Tories to negotiate Brexit. I wonder who you would trust, because yes, certainly Jeremy Corbyn would be considerably worse. The Conservative Party have the economy at the forefront of their minds. They do also, contrary to popular belief, care about society, people's opinions, and housing. And Rachel, you said that the EU will make it very difficult for us to leave. Well, possibly. The European Union is known for being difficult. But frankly, if they are a bunch of difficult people, why do we want to stay with them any longer? The European Union currently trades with us. They export far more to us than we export to them. And the tariffs they would be looking at, if they put tariffs on our goods, we put tariffs on theirs, they would be paying us £12 billion to the £4 billion that we'd be paying them under WTO rules. So we would benefit, really, from not having a free trade agreement in a way, although I still think a free trade agreement would be more beneficial.
Okay, and on that point, I am afraid we're going to have to wrap it up because we're over time. It's been a good debate. We've had several strong arguments put forward, some very long-winded answers, and even a couple of heated arguments. So yeah, I'd like to thank the audience and the panel. One last question which we can all answer together at the same time. Come on now. Will there be a second referendum? Yes! Beautiful. Thanks all for coming.